So welcome to the first colloquium of the year, actually. This is amazing to see all of these faces back in this room. Like, I think we had it hybrid last year, so we had a lot of folks still online, but this year seems to be people are coming back. Welcome, come on in. So we do have pizza arriving from in the future. It'll be arriving just before 12:30, but it's going to be coming around 1 today. So we might pause for a second. Feel free to just jump up and grab some pizza. If you want to wait till the end, you can, but there is pizza coming. I promise you, it wasn't just a false statement. And I wanted to say too, as we get started, Lauren's going to introduce our amazing speaker for today. But I also want to just kind of let you know that our colloquium is quite diverse in terms of the methods that are employed, in terms of the epistemologies and intensive topics. We're going to cover a lot of ground here. And so we ask our speakers before they come in what style they would prefer for presentation. So some colloquiums you might go to and everybody's quiet in the whole thing, and at the end people talk, and others you go to in the econ department or finance department, and it's a sparring match the whole time. We want to kind of meet with each speaker to find out what they prefer. She prefers a discussion throughout, so not a sparring match per se, but a discussion. So she is more in an econ department, so she does appreciate, having questions throughout. And so we'll ask each speaker. But with that being said, we want to make sure that, if you find yourself like talking all the time, you might take some notes and then talk at the end. So her kind of recent things. But so we're going to try to strike that balance this year. I think, did I miss anything? Lauren and I were talking about this. So I'll let Lauren introduce our amazing speaker.
So I'm going to just take your Thank you so much, Dr. Anjali Adukia, for coming. Dr. Adukia is an assistant professor at the Harris School, University of Chicago. She's also the director of the Messages, Identity, Inclusion, and Education lab. She got her PhD from the Harvard School of Education. And her research is broadly interested in reducing inequalities so that children from historically disadvantaged backgrounds can have equal access to educational opportunities. Today, she's going to be presenting her very fascinating work on representation in children's books, but she also has a plethora of studies on topics from discipline in school, residential segregation and school access, access to sanitation and educational outcomes, and she works both in the American and Indian context. Her work has been published in high-quality economics and policy journals. She's been funded by some very reputable funders. Won awards, most notably the APM Dissertation Award, which is many of our graduate students. And just on a personal note, I learned about Dr. Adukia's research from Emily Ofter's Parent Data blog, which is one of my favorite blogs, very popular blog. And I would say that just to say that, her work is really kind of entering popular discourse on these topics, which I think really illustrates how important it is. So thank you so much for visiting us, and we look forward to your presentation on the discussion.
Great, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and it's been a delightful day. On a personal note, I was born in Ohio, just 30 miles from here, and so I'm a big Buckeyes fan. That's the red. So no, but really, thanks for having me. As Lauren mentioned, I'm really interested in understanding the factors that influence educational decisions, with a real focus on basic needs. This idea that if kids can't get their fundamental needs met, it's much harder to think about, higher order needs. A lot of my work was originally in India, and people often say, when you work in developing contexts or in a place like India, just give laptops to every child. And I'm like, kids would like laptops, but they would like toilets, and how much further can we get if we actually have this? But I think another fundamental need is this notion of representation. If you don't see yourself or see others in the world, how does that allow you or allow others to function as full human beings? But these are empirical questions, and part of it is what representation is out in the world. So I'm super excited to be presenting this work, which is joined with my amazing collaborators, Alex Edley from Columbia University, Emily Person, who is a doctoral student, but no one should think of her as someone who is learning. She is absolutely an equal PI. Watch for her on the market. She is incredible. And then my computer science colleagues, Fakizumwami Barali-Radesha and Theodora Sass, without whom we could not have done the AI work that we did. And we're going to be talking about representation, of course. So the process of education and its associated books and curriculum materials necessarily, and by design, transmit the values of society and whose space it is. And the presence and absence of different identities send messages which can contribute to how children view their own potential and the potential of others, which can then shape subconscious defaults. And race and gender represent particularly salient identities, but it's really important to account for when multiple identities intersect and experience exclusion and subordination. And so, there's this idea that representation, people talk about it all the time. There's these big calls saying, we need more representation, but we don't really know if it's happened, but also how do you even measure it? And to be clear, there's two different kinds of representation when we're thinking about it. There's the whether there are identities represented. So you think about a numerical accounting of different identities, but there's also the how people are portrayed or identities are portrayed. So, what is someone's humanity? And so how do you kind of measure both of these? And there is a rich literature that has tried to think about representation, especially in children's content. And this is what we call like traditional content analysis, and it requires everything to be done by hand. So if you just think about books, they go page by page, and you can get very rich information. So you can get the simple and complex representations, but it's really expensive. It's very costly. It's very labor intensive. And there's a lot of fatigue involved. What you're doing on page 2, you might be tired by page 73. And what you're actually coding might change. It's going to necessarily reflect the biases of that individual or that set of individuals. You can only do so much. You can imagine trying to really leverage a lot of the advances in artificial intelligence over the last few years. And so there's computer vision, which is about converting images to data. There's natural language processing, which is converting text to data. And what's nice about this is that whether you have 50 pages or 50,000 pages, once you've done the upfront work of really training your models and whatnot, it doesn't really matter. It's just about computational power at that point. And the biases and the hard part is to really measure the complexities of how people are portrayed, as opposed to whether. But similar to traditional content analysis, AI is a human. It necessarily reflects the biases of the humans who coded the data that went into training the models. And so, but that imprecision is actually going to be systematically applied, on every single page, as opposed to, not being sure how to track it over time. And it's also important to remember that both of these approaches are complementary. They're not substitutes. It's not that you should use AI instead of traditional content analysis. It's just that you can answer different questions. And because there's been such a rich literature that's already really kind of thought about very seriously how to do traditional content analysis, what we really wanted to do is say, let's how do we advance this, machine-based content analysis? And in particular, how do we think about, images? We as social scientists, we should leave a ton of data on the table by ignoring, if we say pictures are worth 1,000 words, how come we're not taking information from pictures themselves? And so what we're really wanting to do is, leverage a lot of these new advances in computer vision to convert images into data, such that more people can actually start to use them systematically. And we use them alongside established text analysis tools. And what we're going to do is we're going to measure the representation of skin color, race, and gender in very influential children's books from the last century. And the 3 constructs we're going to look at are the construct of race. Now, why do we call racial constructs? Because race itself is this very ill-defined, weird concept that is kind of meaningless. It's a way of kind of categorizing humans, but it has a lot of meaning because of, all the societal structures and historical structures that are there. And it does matter because people do treat people differently. People have had very different experiences and continue to have different experiences. And the way we're going to look at it is in 3 main measures. One is skin color, and that's going to be just from images. One is putative race. And what we mean by putative race is the societal value of race that's placed upon people, and that's going to be the US, concept conceptualization of race. And we're going to look at birthplace. So where people are born. So, again, you're, it's like us versus them, or, US versus someplace else. We're going to look at gender identity. Now, this is necessarily limited because it is binarizing gender. Further work is needed to be able to look at gender fluid and non-binary identities. But this is a good example of where AI does a really bad job. So if you wanted to think about pronouns like they, them, it's really hard to disentangle why someone might be using one versus the other. And actually, we did some manual coding in the books that we were looking at. And out of all the books that actually were recognized because of how they highlight the LGBTQI+ experience, there were only 2 non-binary characters, all. of the books that they had out there. And so, so this is where our tools are going to do a much better job picking out female and male. And then we're going to look at age. So are people characterized as younger versus older? And what I'm really probably going to have time to do today is focus on the presence of identity. So again, whether identities are there. If there is time, I will also I will discuss some of the work that we're doing in terms of portrayal that is more on the horizon. And that's kind of saying again, how different, individuals are portrayed, in association with, what domains in life, thinking about sentiment, or they talk about more positively or negatively, and whatnot. And then separately, we're also looking at textbooks that children use in public schools and private schools. So what do we see? We see images are a really important data source, and these machine learning tools really do enable a very cost-effective way of trying to analyze a lot of content at once, in particular for skin color. I often think about like the example of the white and gold dress versus the blue and black dress. Like humans are really bad at measuring color. And so if I look at you, I look at you, I look at you, my measures are going to be different than someone else. And in some ways I'm building in the context that I'm seeing you, how you're dressed, how you speak, and so it's entangled into my measure, my enumerated measure of skin color is my assessment of you. But if I want to disentangle that from income or education or anything else, then I need to have, a more objective or systematic way of measuring it. And so what's nice is that a computer doesn't care about context. It doesn't care about anything else. It's just going to take a weighted average of pixels. And so that's one thing that's really nice about these tools. And there's a lot of work that can be done to improve them. So grad students, please note, this is a ripe world for people to really kind of get involved with. And what do we see? We see that there is inequality and change, in the representation of race, gender, and age on various dimensions. We show that the books that are in this, what we call the mainstream collection, because they are just much more likely to show up in children's worlds, are more likely to show characters with lighter skin, even conditioning on race. We show that children are more likely to be shown with lighter skin than adults across all the collections that we look at. Relative to their share in the US population, people are Black and Latinx are underrepresented in images and text historically. One thing I didn't know here is also that adults, even though these are children's books, adults are more likely to show up in images and text than children. You might expect children to be centered in these stories, but yet adults are the ones who are really being centered. Females are more likely to show up in images rather than text, which is suggestive that which is consistent with the maxim that women should be seen more than heard. And it's kind of suggestive that, women show up more in symbolic representation in the pictures rather than substantive inclusion in the actual story. And then males, especially white males, are just much more likely to be represented, no matter the data source, pronouns, other gender terms, geographic heterogeneity, character names, famous figures, images, just across the board. So, and I just want to kind of highlight what Stephanie mentioned at the beginning. Please feel free to make this a conversation. Feel free to interrupt me, or forget it. Don't think of it as an interruption. Just if something comes to your mind, and you're curious about something, research is a conversation, and like all of this is stuff that's part of the beginning of a larger research agenda, or it's something you might be interested in. So don't hesitate to. Don't wait till the end. Let me put it that way. So yes, please. And can you, if you wouldn't mind, say your name before just.
Rob Reed, I'm on that. So how much of a challenge was the transition from black and white images to color images?
Oh, so and actually what we do, and I'll show you, is that we actually look at when we disentangle the colors, we look at it in 3 different color types. We look at polychromatic human skin color, monochromatic, which is more the black and white, and then the non-typical, which is like the blue robot or the green lily. So then we'll be able to look at that over time and separate it.
I just have a comment.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I'm Jill. I'm a doctoral student. I just want to say that when you said that color is subjective, my bachelor's degree is in fine arts, so I spent tons of time, and I did it in like the 90s at Ohio State, and spent tons of time over at Hopkins Hall in color theory. And you're the first scientist I met that was like, yes, that is great. So thank you.
Oh, yours is deeply philosophical. What is the ground truth of my skin color? Is it what's in this light? Is it in the dark? Is it the morning, the night? Like, what is my skin color? Is it just a reflection if you use one of those? Yeah, so it's really hard to know. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Earlier on,
Yes.
Trevor, thanks for the presentation. You have a us some exemplar books here. What would you say are the sort of typical books and then a follow-on question, just so I have a reference.
Yeah, and so
How
actually-
much travel, or what are we, what,
Perfect question. I will tell you in just a few slides. Yeah, so
Okay.
basically what these are, so think about what the books are. They're actually going to be these Newbery and Caldecott books are the mainstream books. So these are books that are just that rarely go out of print. You know, they go back to the 1920s and 1930s. You think about Bridge to Terabithia or Snowy Day, or, you know.
so then among that, and it's been a while since I've looked at my Colloquium winners, any ones that are like Wind in the Willows, where it's animals that have been
Yes.
anthropomorphized?
Absolutely.
How do you deal with
Yeah,
them as?
Great
subjects?
question. Yes, so one thing in this today, what I'm going to show you, they're all thrown in.
Okay.
Whether it's human or non-human,
Yeah.
in separate work, we are going to separate humans and non-humans, but not so fun fact, or fun fact, if you think about it. I don't show this in the results, but if you wanted to say, okay, what's the predominance by type of character? You know, we see white males predominate, then it's white females, it's then non-humans, then all people of color. So you're more likely to have non-humans than you are to have people of color, you know, regardless of race and gender. So to that question, so the mainstream collection are these Newbery and Caldecott awards, and these are considered to be high literary or artistic value. They are, you know, for those who aren't familiar with Newbery and Caldecott, they're kind of considered the Oscars of children's book awards. And so, you know, they rarely go out of print. I'll show you in a couple of slides just how important and influential they are. Now, as I said, they started in the 1920s and 1930s, but up until 1970, only one author of color could ever receive any of them. And so then people said, wait a second, we need to be centering other voices and other perspectives as well, especially following the civil rights movement and whatnot. And so along came the Coretta Scott King Awards, which were given to books that really, you know, centered the African-American voice and African-American authors. And then it was followed by a whole host of other book awards that were meant to center underrepresented identities. And so we call that the diversity collection. And so the mainstream collection will always be highlighted by pink. This diversity collection will always be this dark blue. But okay, well, let's break this diversity collection into smaller sub-collections that are, you know, focused on people of color or African Americans or people with disabilities or females or, you know, individuals who are LGBTQI+. And, you know, how is it that they center not only the identities that they're recognized for, but are they more likely to take an intersectional lens and actually highlight other identities that they're not being represented or being highlighted for as well? And so it was a chance to kind of see, you know, what are the differences as well. And, you know, just to give you a sense, remember that the pink is showing the mainstream awards, the dark blue is showing the diversity awards. In this case, this like yellowish orange are all other children's books. Here, this is using Seattle Public Library checkout data. The awards are announced, and the solid line are the people, are the books that got the ultimate, you know, the medal. And then there's a set of honorees that are, you know, also get a very conspicuous, you know, award on the front cover of their book, but they're honorees. But, you know, the selection committee members are very clear to say they're not the second best, they're all winners, but, you know, you can see there's a big difference. So around the time of the award announcement, there is this uptick in terms of the checkouts, the daily checkouts for the mainstream award winners. You know, there's also an uptick for the honorees, but not as much. And this sustains itself for years after they get the award. And if we continue this x-axis out, we continue going, whereas you don't see corresponding for the diversity award winners or other children's book awards. So getting one of these awards is a really, really big deal. You know, you could even look at, so this is using numerator data, and so this is book receipt level data. So they have for every single receipt information about, you know, purchaser demographics, their gender, their race, whether they brew beer at home and whatnot. But this even says, okay, how much was each book? And you see that, you know, the average book price for the mainstream awards is less than, you know, the diversity books, you know, and there's more copies sold per title. And so they're more likely to be purchased. They're also cheaper. So, you know, when you start to try to think about what are the economics that are driving people's decisions, you know, why might they choose one book or the other, you can imagine some of the decisions, like some of the, some of the factors that are really influencing people's decisions in all of this. And so, yes, please.
So I'm Alex. Thanks for this talk. I just have a question to put some of this into context, like. I think I'm around like a really select group of people that like to like read to their kids and stuff, but I'm just curious, like, in general, how many books does like a family check out in the library? How many books does like a kid buy? So like, when you look at this, like, should I expect that like a normal kid is like 4 mainstream books and 1 diversity book, or like, I know you can't like do an analysis.
Yeah, so I think actually, so I can't answer that question in terms of like, because this selection as to who buys.
Yeah,
You know,
so I'm
who
trying to get
checks
it
out.
out, but I know.
And in some ways, I actually think the nice thing about having the Seattle Public Library data and then the book purchase data is that there's a Venn diagram. If you're getting from the library, maybe you're wealthy, but you're also probably less likely to have the money to buy the books. If you're buying books, then you obviously have the money to buy them, but you may be less likely to go to the library. Maybe you still do. There's people who are in the middle, but it kind of gets both segments or 2 different segments of society, though related as well. And so, by seeing that there are actually similar patterns for both, tells us actually that we're kind of going, like that there's similar demand on both sides, regardless of one's socioeconomic status or background. And actually, one thing that we do towards the end, depending if there's time, what I'll show you is, when we look at, like, for example, holdings by neighborhood in Seattle, richer neighborhoods, or more, actually, I should say, like more white neighborhoods are more likely to have mainstream books, whereas less white neighborhoods are more likely to have diversity books in their holdings as well. And so, so what's driving that and who's determining, these are all correlations.
Yeah, oh yeah, I didn't even mean it as like a threat, I was just kind of curious, like, for a regular kid, how many books do they get seen at home? Like, is it 4 or 5? Like, I don't know, that's all I was trying to think of, just like,
Good question.
but it's kind of in the
Actually,
context
I
of
would be
scale.
curious as well, how many books do people have on their libraries at home? And also, this isn't just mainstream diversity, there's also all these other children's books, which, like Captain Underpants, it's not. I'm guessing did not. But yet are also very popular, so, yeah. A good question, I should
Okay,
find
I
out.
see. So all other children's books, those are the non-award winners. And so there's obviously a lot more of those than the award winners.
Exactly, yeah.
And so is your analysis going to include those other ones, or your?
So what I'm going to show you in terms of the representation is just in the mainstream and diversity of winners.
Okay.
And in part, so the next thing I'll show you are actually the tools of how we convert these books into the data that we want to use. But while the artificial intelligence is great, whatever, the most time consuming part of this whole project was digitizing books. And so to even think about digitizing all of them, just it's
have you thought about how representative the mainstream and diversity are going to be of the total sales of all children's books? Or if you took kind of like the top 10 sellers to libraries, are most of those going to be included in?
Well, I think that's where, for example, you can just see, right, that there are way more copies sold per title of the mainstream books than the other books themselves, right? And also the fact that they're just much more likely to get checked out. So actually, to us, what really matters too is what are children seeing, right? What are they exposed to? And then therefore, really important question is, if we care about norms and what creates norms and what shapes norms over time, if we believe that it comes in part from the influences when you see as a child, okay, well, what's the content in the books that you see? Well, there's no way for us to really know the universe of content that's out there because, there's so many different sources of, of representation in our worlds. So at least we know that these are just much more likely to show up in kids' books, in kids' hands. And this is just looking at the personal side. In audits of different school libraries and school classroom shelves, you are just much more likely to see mainstream books. And in particular, I think that mainstream books are the ones that really are quite influential. I think of the diversity books almost, like we are saying nothing about optimal representation, but because these are committee members that have read every single book that have come out and they're really trying to say, well, what, who is really centering the female experience or, the South Asian experience? in some ways you would expect them to be almost an upper bound or close to an upper bound of the representation of that particular identity in that particular year. And so we think of this as kind of an upper bound. You know, frankly, in the public discourse, these mainstream books like Newbery and Caldecott, there are many people who would say, oh, those are just books of the elite liberals. And so like we can actually test it, we can actually see. Well, if they are indeed, we might then expect it to, we thought before we actually started that we would see these as showing very diverse characters, you know, a diverse range of characters on many different fronts. And we actually thought more than anything, it would be a good test of tools, you know, because we wanted to really look at textbooks more than anything. And it just turned out that, wow, there's some really interesting patterns that we certainly do not expect to see.
When it comes to, hi, I'm Tegan, and when it comes to the diversity books, do you see other types of diversity represented more often in those books?
So here we are only going to be, I'm only going to show you race, gender, and age. But it would be nice to be able to look at other things. So for example, we want to be able to identify, you know, different markers of disability. You know, we would love to be able to look at sexual orientation. We would love to be able to look at a lot of these other, and it's just figuring out if it's not a human looking at it, how do we train this machine to think like a human, to be able to pull out the cues that this character has this identity or this set of identities, even though visible identities, but there's also identities that are not necessarily so visible. And that's much harder for a computer to do. So yeah, really great.
Hi, this is Susan. I'm Lydia. Again, so based on this chart, it's clear that when a book is awarded, one of these awards, like obviously there's an uptick in people checking out books. So I'm wondering what role awarding a Newbery or a Caldecott award might play in maintaining the book category. You know, is it like libraries are promoting them more? Like how many parents are really clued into these awards and what books are included in them? But I'm also curious as to how these awards might play a role in promoting representation, and maybe you'll get into that.
No, actually, but I think that that's something, so we don't get to it so much, but I think that just highlights why these awards, like, we are basically going from the assumption and the premise that these awards are really important. And that's partially because we're building off of the literature of people who've used traditional content analysis, and a lot of the more traditional methods to show that, you know, when something gets an award one year, you actually suddenly see in the following years, publishers starting to put out more books that look like that. And so then there's kind of this like follow on, and, you know, sometimes it's related to other things that are going on in the world. Librarians, and, you know, often make up comprise these selection committees. You know, they can also see themselves as subversive as well, and they might be political, they might be choosing books for certain reasons, and who knows, and it would be wonderful to be able to do some sort of analysis based off of the selection committee demographics. That is so hard. We're trying to do this other work looking at the identities of authors and illustrators and how that relates to character identities separately, and that already is really hard. We were talking about how, you know, a lot of these children's book authors don't have web pages. They don't have their picture online. You don't know much about them. And so then to find out about selection committee members themselves can be quite difficult as well. But no, they're super important. And it does seem like there are, you know, not copycats exactly, but people learn a lot from it. Publishers, they really want, you know, to get one of these awards because it matters a lot for the long run. So. All right, so let me tell you about how we, you know, convert these book scans into data. So we start out, and first I'm going to tell you about how we convert images into data. So we have a scan of every page of every book. Now we say, okay, fine, like there's a lot in the image, but we're starting, you know, let's just start with the face. I know there's a full human being, there's a full character there, there's potentially an interaction, there's lots going on here. You know, but let's just start with the face. And I thought, oh, that's gonna be pretty straightforward, right? Like Google Vision API, there's some state-of-the-art tools out there. And certainly Dora Satz, who is my computer vision colleague on this, she thought it would be very simple. And so we said, Caldecott books, let's start there because they are books that have been recognized for their artwork. So let's take a bunch of books that we know have a lot of faces in them, put it through. And up here, FDG is face detection using Google Vision. That's at the top. So out of this little subsample of books, we identified 8 faces. Oh, no, hey, this is gonna be a bigger road than we expected. And so then we realized, oh, we're gonna have to train our own models, because why is it that, they only detected 8 faces? Because they were based off of photographs. They were not created for children's books. And about 80% of the images in our books are illustrated. And so how do you identify that robot, or the llama, or whatever it is, in addition to the black and white type of images? And so then we actually had to train our own model. And, as you can see, we went from, in total out of our old corpora, getting 4,500 faces, we were able to get 7,000 faces. And so, as I said, this is super loaded. I did not come into this thinking I was going to be working in the computer science world, but I would say computer scientists are awesome. They're doing the coolest stuff for industry. Their idea of policymakers and practitioners are like the Googles and Bosches of the world. Like, oh, I'm going to put something in a dishwasher. So I went to this computer science conference, and this guy had this this is a total aside, but as I said, it's a conversation, right? So he created this keyboard with just a little webcam, and he was like, oh, what are you going to do with this? Like, you can take it to low income schools, and they can then use this to have keyboards and whatever. And he's like, oh no, I just get a lot of money from Google for it. But that's a cool idea. Actually, I don't know these tools myself. Like, I'm not the one coding, but I collaborate with computer scientists. And that's where anyone who really wants to use these tools, like, go collaborate with your computer science colleagues around, the university or at other universities. So many of these people are hungry to make a social impact, and we know that what they're doing isn't just making someone a lot of money, but is actually improving the world in some way, but they just don't know that. They don't think from that lens, just like I don't think from a monetary finance lens, and so there's a lot of complementary skill sets to bring to bear to really advance a lot of stuff. And Dora had only worked in the the for-profit side of things. And this has really changed kind of her own trajectory as well. So anyway, so we trained our own model. We now have 58,000 faces. Okay, so now we want to identify skin color. Okay, but the fact is that, okay, we've identified, now we've got these bounding boxes, which identify the face, but there's a lot there. There's the background, there's the hair, there's the ribbon, there's the eyes, there's, in this case, it's not teeth, but sometimes, and so I don't want all of that. I just want the facial area of interest. So what we do is we apply something called fully connected convolutional neural network. And you're going to hear this term neural net a lot. All this means, if you see this neural net, is you're just trying to train the computer to think like a human. Like, how does it see the world like a human? And what this is doing in particular, and this notion of what we're really doing is something called skin segmentation, and it's a horribly gruesome name that comes from biology because they literally segmented skin in order to be able to measure things, but they adopted it in computer science. And what this does is it just identifies all the peripheral landmarks with the edges of the face, where the eyes, where the mouth, and kind of see these little green dots. And then we kind of connect the outside layer that gives us a convex hull of these facial landmarks. So that's kind of our main face mask. But as you can see, we get a little bit of background there if we don't want it. We want to refine that. And so, we do something called a continuous conditional random field module. All that means, a CRF, is simply saying, okay, let me look at this pixel and all the pixels around it. And I'm going to say, is that skin or not skin? Is that skin or not skin? Is that skin or not skin? And it goes around and it predicts then whether that spot is facial area of interest or skin. And then it keeps it or doesn't. And then it gives us our refined face. But as I said, now, okay, fine, I have this, but how do we get skin color from this? I don't want all of that. It's not that I can just take one spot and boom, because again, our faces are made of many, many colors. So you really want a weighted average of all of that. But also I want to try to get rid of the eyes and the hair and that kind of stuff, because that shouldn't go into my measure of skin color itself. And so then we do something called K-means clustering. In this case, our K is going to equal to 5. And what that's simply doing is taking every pixel and getting it to the K or 5th closest color, such that I can take a weighted average. And I'm just going to show, this is like a little bit easier to see. So fine, we have this picture, right? Now I want to get rid of the eyes, and the hair. So I'm going to cluster every single pixel into the 5th closest group. So it's going to weight it by predominance. And you can see the eyes, for example, are now this beige as opposed to the white. And most of the time, this like the eyes and the hair fall into the bottom two clusters because they show up the least. So I drop the smallest two clusters, and then I take a weighted average, because each of these are by predominance, of the remaining like skin pixels that are there. And then that gives me a representative skin color for every single face that I have detected in my sample. And then we can actually get two different measures from that. You can, so there's like a continuous measure from 0 to 100 of perceptual tint, so from darkest to lightest, and which one, so then it's really easy if you want to put into a regression or whatever, something a little more precise. But it's not like when I go to someone and I'm like, you're a 42, you're an 83, and so really people think about this more. You think about the emoji scales or the Patrick scale or darker, medium, lighter. And so we thought about 8 different ways. In the end, for this, we just said, we're going to take an agnostic approach. We're just going to break that distribution up into thirds. So we're going to have the darkest tercile, the medium tercile, the lightest terciles. In other work, we are taking a more data-driven approach, which then allows for the 3-dimensional nature of our GP space and whatnot. But for now, we then get these 2 measures, continuous measure and coarse measure. There was a question about what we do about like black and white or, polychromatic. And so each of the dots that you see represents the representative skin color for every face. And we did not, again, we were trying to advance algorithmic ways of being able to do this. We wanted to remove as much human input as possible because, again, it's just trying to advance that part of the conversation because people have really worked hard on the other part of the conversation. And so what Emily actually realized, so she was a photographer in a previous life, and she knew a lot about color theory. And she also realized, so one thing is y-axis. So each of these rows, by the way, is for a different collection. But the y-axis actually represents the standard deviation of the R, G, and D values of the face. Again, like one way of measuring color, R, G, and D. And the closer that these R, G, and D values are, the less vibrant the color, the more likely it was going to be monochromatic or black and white. And so, she did this whole process and realized that anything under like standard deviation of 17 was more likely to be monochromatic. So we just said, okay, fine. I'm just going to say anything under standard deviation of 17, boom, we're going to call that monochromatic. That's what you see here. Okay, but now we have the remaining, polychromatic colors. Well, we want to separate the humans from the aliens, so how do we do that? Well, another thing that Emily realized was that when R is greater than G is greater than D, it was more likely to be human. And so we said, all right, we're going to apply that. So that became our human skin color rule. And everybody else was non-typical. And you can see, they're here, you're more likely to have the blues and the greens and the red, or the pinkishes. Here you have the beige and the yellow and the brown. And here you're more likely to have the white and gray. It is not perfect, but it does a lot of the job. And then we can actually do our analysis separately by skin color type or all together. I see that there's food. How about let me just finish
Keep going.
3
Yep,
slides,
absolutely.
and then people want to eat, and then we can come back, or do I continue? It's up to you.
Why don't you continue, I think?
Oh,
What do you
okay.
guys think?
Oh,
Or
then
do you think we should pause?
You should, I want to make sure people eat for sure, so.
I vote continue.
Continue, right? So, in addition, we got the same, so please feel free, yes.
So you might answer this question on the
Yeah.
side, I'm not so sure. So you're using the K-means, for like a weighted average of skin tone. I'm curious if there's differences between the adults and the children and like the size of the face and how much reflection there might be, in the photo that's contributing to those lighter skin tones.
Yeah, so the thing is that, so most of these are not photos, most of them are illustrations.
Yeah.
And so certainly you can imagine size, but we actually weight each face. Basically, the skin color that's given to each, the representative skin color that's determined for each face is based off the size of that. It's whether it's big or small, whatever proportion it is, it's not gonna take into account, it doesn't matter if you've got a smaller face or a bigger face.
Okay.
So it's still gonna give you some sort of weighted, whatever the weighted average of that face is.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but yeah, good question. So, and this is just, but these slides are simply saying that the skin pigmentation also is not perfect, right? Sometimes we get partial faces, we just get hair, we just get little bits here and there. Now, what happens, it still goes through our whole pipeline and we still, get a weighted average of something, right? We have monochromatic faces, so what does that look like? How do we get that? And we then get a weighted average still of whatever it is that we're seeing. And then similarly with illustrations, if there's animals or, whatever creatures might be there or sides of faces, we are going to still be capturing whatever it is that, and that all gets thrown in there. So it's not perfect. There's a lot of research to be done, but this is again, the research is first, it's not the last step. Now, separately, so fine, that's how we get our measures of skin color. Now, one thing that these tools can also do is they can predict various features. And so you can predict things like race, gender, age. This also predicts emotion. Now we're going back to taking the entire box, or back to the full box, and we're going to use, we train a Google AutoML Vision feature classifier, and it gives us a prediction for female, race, or for gender, race, and age. And it gives us kind of the majority prediction. It's not perfect. As we talked about, these are constructs of society that, how are we even determining, what does it mean to be of a particular race or gender, or, and even we have humans. So we have humans go through and actually classify these. And so we have 3 different humans, all from the US. And so really, what's the ground truth? You kind of say, well, what their inner reliability or inner rater reliability is in some ways the theoretical maximum of whatever you can expect the model to be accurate on, right? Because if you want the model to think like humans, okay, well, how much do humans agree? That's the most they can expect of a machine. For race, the maximum agreement, 66%. For the same set of 5,000 pixels. So, for gender, 72%. And looking at this exact same photos or images. And yet these humans still could not agree on gender and race, or age for that matter. And age, we can either do young or older, or we can even break it down to infant, child, teenager, adult, senior. And so, I think it just kind of goes again to the notion, a much deeper notion, like how are we categorizing humans in this world, and what does it mean, and how much of it is coming with our own assumptions, but it doesn't happen, and we do things with this. And so, and whatever imprecision I'm applying to this face is the same imprecision I'm applying to every single face in my entire, all 58,000 faces. So it's at least going to be consistent throughout. Whereas with a human, again, you get tired. It's going to be based off of the context. There's a lot of things that you're, potentially pulling into this. And I just want to underscore once again, every single component of this represents an opportunity for further innovation and work. So if there is anything you're interested in or excited about, whether it's in books, whether it's in, movies, whether it's in real life, these skin color, we should be thinking about skin color much more in society. Think about these random assignment to judge studies that are out there. When a judge is looking at someone, conditioning on race, conditioning on offense, is it that they give people with darker skin colors harsher sentences? Is it that they, are teachers treating students differently because of skin color? There is nothing about my knowledge that makes me different than normal. Like if you see differences, then that is maybe a fundamental test of discrimination. And if we can actually call more attention to it, then maybe there's ways to actually mitigate these sources. But anyway, this gives us a much more objective way, how do we measure that dependent variable? Well, as opposed to the human trying to measure it, now we can actually measure this much easier if we just have photos. Think about driver's licenses or yearbook photos or passport photos. That's consistent lighting. It's good pictures for society. You run it through one of these algorithms, you've got a wealth of information to really try to think about something that can really matter. So, and some people say, well, it's so icky to think about skin color. Well, isn't it icky to think about race or gender? Why is that not ickier? Is it? But it's also real. It really matters for people how when we look at people, what your nationality is, what your accent is. People treat people differently all the time based off their identities. And colorism is around the world. Race is a weird construct. It's very region specific. And what we think about race here is different than what we might think about race in a place like India or elsewhere. But color within families, there's differences in color. I mean, you had a question. I totally stopped you.
No, it's okay. Katie, hi. So this is like a little bit of a, I just wonder if you think in a big picture way of these differences in how we perceive skin color, or like, you know, I could label that little girl as something different than somebody else does and doing an analysis of faces, right? Have you thought about how that might influence the way people perceive whether or not they're represented? Like, are people more likely to see themselves, not see themselves? Or is it, do you know what I mean? Like what are, I know there's these biases that go into how we label somebody from where you're sitting on like the race or skin color spectrum or the gender spectrum, whatever, right? Is going to influence how you, but the broader picture of like, how does the way we see people affect the way we think about the level or the way representation is happening? Have you thought?
Yeah, no, I think that represents a whole set of like empirical questions that need to be studied and whatnot. But there are these studies that show, for example, one where, you know, kids of color are more likely to identify with books that show Martin Luther King than they are other books, even that like have someone of their same gender. Because suddenly there's a person who has a darker skin color that's shown as opposed to just, you know, light skin color. And so, but that's like, you know, a quality, and who knows? I think that there's more work to be done.
Sure, I think
Depending on
it's
how
like,
salient it is.
it's
So,
almost like this other aspect of your data is that you have this like measure of differences and like you could see the way people see these images based on their characteristics. It's like you have the secondary bunch of data that's like also interesting to
yeah,
understand,
and
if that
actually, I
makes
think,
sense.
so one thing that we've talked a lot about potentially doing is more kind of lab experiments or kind of experiments in schools or whatever, where we show, like do A/B testing, where we can show, you know, this set of students, you know, this kind of data, we tweak it somehow and show, or not data, but this kind of images or text, show them this, see how do they respond, how is it, what are the beliefs,
Yeah.
what is, so I think there's a lot of really interesting things to potentially look at that for sure. Did you?
I was gonna, sorry, sort of related to Trevor's comment and Katie's thing. For the bottom, like four, is that all amongst human faces? It's like, I was just thinking like,
Everybody.
how's a kid view Daniel Tiger, right? Like,
Yeah.
with themselves or whatever, like, so, because what really surprised me was that 66% concordance seemed really low.
Oh,
So
so,
like,
oh, yeah,
what
yeah.
share is like not human and then,
I should
people
be
just-
clear,
Gotcha.
those 66% were all human.
okay,
faces.
all right, and then that
Yes,
shocking me as well.
correct. Those are
Okay.
human faces
Yeah,
now. If
okay.
we were to show Daniel Tiger in there. Yeah, I'm not sure how they would.
Yeah.
But I will say this is done on all faces. And so again, but that does say something about when they show that animal, are they like making these like West European
Yeah.
features? Are they making them like South Asian features? Are they making them like Korean features? Are they making them, whose features are they actually showing? Because that would be what would be identified
Yeah.
within the model. And actually what we see is, and it doesn't show up in this paper, but among the non-humans, they are more likely to be classified as white because the way that the illustrator is actually drawing the faces. So they are more likely to present them with what might be stereotypically white features as opposed to, you know, other nationality type features. Yeah.
So I'm wondering too, like, just related to like Daniel Tiger, because that's like Mr. Rogers, that's Daniel Tiger, Mr. Rogers, right? Okay. So it's like Mr. Rogers, and then they've got like the King dude, and he's a white guy, like you have the sort of, the people that show up are also white people in that context. And so, you know, or you have like Christopher Robin and all his people. And so that to me would influence the ways in which the animals are read. Is that?
And yeah, no, I think these are all important, right? We don't look at them, and we don't look at exactly how the reader is perceiving all of this in terms of what are their feelings, what are their beliefs, how the shape. But I actually think that is an important set of questions to be studied. Absolutely. All right, so let me tell you how we convert text into data. So, you know, again, we take a scan of every face. We use something called optical character recognition or OCR to encode each character such that the computer can read it. And then we say, okay, how do we get measures of race, gender, and age from the text? Well, one source is names. And so we use something called identity recognition from this, it basically takes all the unstructured text, it pulls out any proper names essentially. So it can be Rosa Parks, but it could also be rupee or, currency or New York or whatever. And then what we do is to kind of pull up the famous characters. There's a data set called the Pantheon 2.0 data set. It's going through Wikipedia, and, classified all of the famous people that, again, that this model pulled out. And from there, they get gender, birthplace, and they also, what we do then is we actually manually code race. So that gives us measures of gender, birthplace, and putative race. But of course, there's the, Lauren, went to the lab, Stephanie, went to space, whatever it is, but like there are these first names. So we take the remaining names, we take the first word, and then we actually match it to social security data. So for example, the word Cameron, 91% of people in social security data born in Cameron identify as male. So we call Cameron then a male name. The word New Yorker, new would show up, but new doesn't show up in the social security data, so it gets thrown out. And so then that gives us, measures for names of gender, birthplace, and race. But there's other words like pronouns or words like queen, uncle, and whatnot, where they have gendered aspects to them. And so, that gives us our words related to gender, but also words like aunt and uncle and boy and girl, they have age aspects to them, whether they're older or younger. And so, the way that we get our words related to age are by using like aunt, uncle is older and girl, boy is younger. And so then that gives us a set of measures of race, gender, and age, remembering that images are just faces, lots of work to be done, the full characters and the interactions between them. We end at 1:30, is that correct?
Yeah.
So I am gonna, but please go ahead, yes.
It's great research. Thank you so much for this talk. And you mentioned about using driver license or passport for picture. I mean, that will be more convenient than
Way
it's a big challenge.
Yes.
But I recall a research back in 2015 that those technologies also have reflect the biases, like they were matching congressmen and senators with criminal mugshots, right? So when how do you study bias with a biased instrument?
But
I know
it's in every question that we ask in this world,
but
it's filtered through our own lenses, which, my lenses have been shaped through a world full of structural racism and sexism and, like there's all these different lenses which are naturally going to make its way. And so, yes, absolutely. Like, how do you study any of these questions? In some ways, part of it's by even just starting to recognize that we have what is our positionality? What is it that's kind of informing our questions and our ideologies, and why are we even asking this? But also, I think it's important when you ask any question to make sure that when you ask it, there's not one answer. If I, was saying earlier, like, so my job market paper was about looking at like sanitation in schools. And so, it's like, do toilets matter for girls? And if the only correct answer is yes, and if I got a 0 or a negative, if that was not okay, I shouldn't be asking the question, because then that's advocacy, not research. So any question we ask, we have to be okay with any answer. And then that will actually help us learn more about the world. And, it's thinking about what are the different biases that might influence why we might see one set of results versus another. And maybe that'll help inform the mechanisms that we want to then study or not study. And so.
Machines can think like humans, right? When you are trying to remove the bias, their actual outcomes are unpredictable. They don't perform that well. So, at least for the current state of the research on AI bias. So, deeply interesting. I think your research can, because you trained yourself, not using historical data.
But it still has the bias of our own beliefs, regardless. No matter what, we always bring bias to all. And I think it's important to recognize. Now, the thing about AI is that then if you want to try to minimize bias, I don't mean minimizing it, or if you want to capture a lot of different kinds of bias, then you want more coders from different sets of backgrounds, who then you use all of their codes to help train the models. So then all of those perspectives get baked in and then can be applied, systematically throughout. But you're never going to get away from the fact that bias is going to be applied. So All right, so what I'll show you quickly is just a few like descriptive results of what we actually see in terms of using these tools in the books. And remember, the pink represents the mainstream and this dark blue represents the diversity. And what you see is that and the way to read these is the left side means darker skin, right side here is lighter skin. And it shows that the mainstream collection is much more likely to show characters with lighter skin than the diversity collection. Again, like the diversity collection, you see more diffuse representation. And when you think about the coarse spins, they're more likely to show characters in the medium or lighter skin terciles. And as expected, you see more characters in the darker or medium terciles in the diversity collection. We break it down, you see most of the darker skin representation in the people of color in African American collection, but also in the female collections as well, which suggests that maybe the authors of these books are taking more intersectional lens as well. You can look over time, and so you see that the mainstream collection has become darker in terms of the characters over time, but it's also had an uptick in lightness over the last 3 decades. And part of this is actually, you see that they are showing more characters, for example, that are identified as Black, but they're giving them lighter skin over time as well. So, what's the decision that they're making in terms of really trying to appeal to the median reader? Whereas that you can see where they've kind of ended up is around where the diversity collection started in the 1970s, and that's why it's truncated. You see similar results, whether it's monochromatic or non-typical. But what's really interesting is that, remember, we can also predict what the race is. And so what this is showing is 4 characters that are identified as a given race. What are the skin color distributions? And in each of these, buckets, you see that the mainstream collection is more likely to show characters. So for example, let's just take this upper left quadrant. All the characters here are predicted to be Asian. The mainstream collection is more likely to show characters that are predicted to be Asian with lighter skin and characters that are predicted to be Asian in the diversity collection. And this is just an example. So all the characters here are predicted to be Black. But you can see in the mainstream collection, they're more likely to highlight the skin or lighten it a little. Whereas in the diversity collection, they're more likely to show kind of the richness of skin tone, while still you can see the characters. It's not, that, oh, you have to suddenly lighten them. Because I actually even did this in the first place. Is one of my RAs, she ran Martin Luther King, a book with a bunch of pictures of Martin Luther King through, and almost all of them were classified on the cusp of light and medium. And she's just like, and she's not from the US, she's like, he had dark skin, and I was like, he does, and so it shows the decisions that illustrators themselves can make in terms of how many light pixels they can add and kind of what it is that they're trying to do in terms of. In fact, there's this one study that showed that certain conservative outlets darkened Obama's skin, and certain other outlets actually lightened it. And so how is it that they were trying to portray and influence opinions? I'll just move through, regardless of collection, you're just more likely to see white men show up, even in the African American collection and the people of color collection. It's only, and these are, it's only in the African American collection that you see that Black males are also likely to show up, but they're still, percentage point less than white males. And within every single racial classification, men are more likely to show up than women as well. When you look at the top 10 appearances of famous people in the main collection, they're all men. You have to get to number 16 before you get to a woman, and that's a white woman, Eleanor Roosevelt. And you have to get to number 43 before you get to a woman of color, and that's Rosa Parks. Even in the diversity collection, the top 10, among the top 10, Rosa Parks is the only female that shows up. You could imagine, Henry says nothing about optimal representation, but how does this benchmark to US population? But that's what the orangish yellowish line shows here. And so you see that people who are white have been overrepresented since the 1930s. People who are Latinx have just not been represented despite a growing set of population. People who are Black were underrepresented up until 3 decades ago. And so there is some change, but there's also still, if you think parity is what you're trying to get to, then this is, one thing that shows that it's not quite there. Another way of kind of categorizing people is thinking about birthplace. And so the dots show the birthplace of the famous people that are shown. And you see in the mainstream collection that most people are in the US or Europe, where there's much more geographic heterogeneity in the diversity collection. And when you break it down by gender, most of this geographic heterogeneity that we see is among male famous figures as opposed to female famous figures. Sometimes when people look at this, they say, oh, but, you know, Anjali, the presidents have been mostly, you know, white men. And if that were the case, we should see no one from Europe, because you have to have been born in the US in order to be president as well. And so we really just want to focus on heads of state. There's heads of state all around the world. And actually there's quite a bit of gender representation on that front as well. In terms, I'll just show a couple more results, and then, so basically what we see is that the mainstream collection is actually more male-centered than any other collection. And while the female collection is the most female-centered of all the collections, it's less female-centered than the mainstream collection is male-centered. You know, there has been a growth over time. But the thing is, sometimes people say, well, when I was growing up, you know, he, him, these were the gender neutral terms. Of course, you're going to see more male representation historically, but then we shouldn't actually see, so we should see more in terms of pronouns, but not in terms of names and other tokens like, you know, queen or king, etc. But regardless of the collection, we actually see that it's only the female collection that ever gets to 50% or above. And even in famous figures, if you like, so if Rosa Parks shows up 3 times in a book, then previously she gets a value of 3. But if you only count her as like unique famous people, this is the female collection. I'm sorry, I guess the legend got cut off. But even in the female collection, you know, barely 2/3 are women, and the rest are men. In fact, the most out of the top 5 famous people that show up in the female collection, they're all men. There are 4 of them are men and only 1 woman. John F. Kennedy is the most predominant. And what this shows is that women show up more in images than text, which really suggests that we need some more symbolic inclusion in pictures rather than substantive inclusion in the actual stories. And then I'll end with this, but this is just basically showing the purple here are showing adults in images, and the green are showing children in images. Here, the top row are younger words in text, and the bottom row are older words in text. And what you see is that, you know, older words and adults in images are just much more likely to show up. And if you look at it by the census, they are also, adults are overrepresented relative to their share in the population. But this is probably the result that made me stop. Because so remember, you know, that purple here, in this case, purple is child and green is adult. So sorry, I got flipped. But across the board, what we're showing you is that children are more likely to be shown with lighter skin than adults, regardless of collection. And the reason this really stuck me is that we live in a society where we, you know, equate youth with innocence. And in this case, we're kind of equating youth with lightness or potentially whiteness. And what are those implicit or explicit messages that are being sent to kids? You know, in a world where we treat Black children as older than they are, does that mean that we're treating them as less innocent? Who is considered to be older or treated as an adult versus not? And so, you know, I think a lot more work needs to be done, but these are just correlations. This is generating hypotheses to be tested, but, you know, what are those assumptions that are kind of being developed in kids over time? But I know that I went over 4 minutes, so.
That clock is actually fast. You're only 2 minutes over.
But I'm yeah, no, I really appreciate your questions and engagement, and thanks for having me.
I'm just gonna stick around and talk to the doctoral students afterwards. So if any of you also have questions, any of the professors or anything, you're welcome to stick around and chat with her too. But we have like about 15 to 30 minutes, I think. I forget on the schedule, Katie. Is it a half hour that we get to? So we get till 2 that the doc students